Does this economy need a stimulus of some kind?
Well,
whether from the Fed or from the Congress?
I don't think we can live on stimulus forever. Certainly withdrawing at a too rapid a rate in such a fragile economy makes no sense. And the plan of sort of gradually tightening policy over a long period is the right one. But the real problem is just that our system's so paralyzed, it isn't able to be creative. The private sector is creative, but the government is just paralyzed. The tax system needs to be reformed. We need to have areas where we spend money, like infrastructure, improving education. There are other areas where I think we need to rein in a bit on entitlements. And everyone wants to keep what they have, and we're in this very static situation in a changing world, and it's not a healthy one. You know, I see the president's strategy, the long-term strategy is really let's raise taxes on the wealthy, then let's do it again, then let's do it again. Yeah. And finally, we can go to people and say, you know what, this isn't enough. We need to cut entitlements. We need to raise taxes on the middle class. We have to have the private sector do some things that the government sector is doing now. We have to have changes. But as long as there's this politically low-hanging fruit, it's really hard to move ahead more broadly.
Is the debt the problem that there's some disagreement? Your colleague Paul Krugman, writing in the column, every other column in the New York Times says it's not about the debt, it's not about the debt. Is it about the debt?
Well, of course it's about the debt. I mean, and we have record public debt, private debt internationally. It's not the only thing. I mean, clearly we want to leave our children a good infrastructure. We want to leave them improving technology, a good education system, all the things the earlier generations left us. But on the other hand, if you have a very large debt, it creates all kinds of intergenerational tensions, distributional tensions, and we're at a level where historically it's been problematic, and I think it makes sense to gradually rein it in. I do not advocate anything radical. My co-author, Carmen Reinhart, similarly does not advocate anything radical, but I don't think it's
a radical meaning a radical. By radical, you mean some austerity,
draconian
austerity. Yeah,
draconian austerity. In fact, I would welcome more infrastructure spending if it were well spent, because certainly the United States needs that. Although I would like to see more private funding of infrastructure. And have the private sector gradually take over some of the things on which the government has held a monopoly. And, we need to do improvements and reforms. I don't think spending money is the solution. There's smart ways to spend it for sure. But I don't buy this idea that bigger Keynesian stimulus is going to solve our problems. I think we need more fundamental reform. And my colleagues like Paul Krugman would say, well, I hear that all the time, but I really want to see I want to see stimulus now. And I think we've been doing this for a long time. We're doing it at 7% of GDP at the moment. And I think it's sensible to try to slowly rein it in. You can't compare the United States and Europe because we privately buy a lot of things that they do publicly. Over time, this may sound very theoretical, but it's very important. Over time, the things the government provides, very service intensive, they're always going to keep getting more expensive. And I think we need to think about bringing the private sector into our infrastructure, maybe more into education, other areas where that brings in money, brings in innovation. I don't think we can live in a world where the government does everything that it does today. We need regulation. You can't just turn over things to the private sector. But if we don't do that, then the costs are just going to rise inexorably. You can be a conservative and say, I don't want a large government, but it's going to grow anyway. You need to try to decide what the government has to provide versus what it tries to regulate. And we're actually on a pretty healthy side of that compared to a place like France, where government spending is more than half of GDP. But it's going to keep creeping up, and I think we need to be creative and alert to that. You're growing entitlements, government services are getting more expensive. People are going to pay more and get less. I clearly, there are areas of our tax system which are egregious in terms of their inequality implications, things like carried interest.
Right.
But of course, I'd like to see a bigger plan. I'd like to see reform. That seems to be just a dream at the moment.
Now, folks, what this guy actually says is that the Western democracies in the past 50 years or so have been growing the size of their governments, and the central planning has been pushing a free market into a corner. While in China, conversely, a free market has been gradually taking the roots at the expense of central planning. And maybe that's an explanation for the Chinese prosperity during that time period and a somewhat Western stagnation, if not a decline. Ken Rogoff is a professor at Harvard University and chess grandmaster, a pretty sharp-minded individual. But guess what? His work has been rejected as having some computation errors. Yes, some statistical numbers, I guess. My point, there is no sufficient scientific evidence to corroborate that democracy is superior to one-party system when it comes to implementation of an efficient economic system. There is an equal probability for both political systems to implement either central planning or free market. Political system speaks only about how the government has been formed, not what that government would be like. Don't judge a book by its cover.